All right, guys, welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is Triathlon South Australia's first online workshop that we have hosted. All but certain we are planning on getting some more of these going. So we do have the next one already lined up, which will be around a bit of bike maintenance and a bit of power training on the bike. So that will be our next one. We want to give as much knowledge as we can, and that's why we've got these two awesome presenters on tonight for us. So we've got Chris Bishop or Dr. Chris Bishop, I should say, from the Biomechanics Lab, who will go over what he does and what his organisation does. And then we've also got Josh Willoughby from Joggers World, who are really innovative in the way that they fit running shoes to cater for everyone's style of run. But we'll chuck on Chris to start with. So Chris, if you can hear me, do you want to unmute yourself and sort of give a 2-minute description of yourself and what you do in the Biomechanics Lab? Is he still there? Chris. I reckon he just logged out, and there we go. You there, Chris? Unmute. You there?
Can you hear me?
Yep, now we can. Perfect. All right. So everyone, this is Dr. Chris Bishop. Chris, if you could just give everyone a bit of a bio on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me. So I guess my background is as a podiatrist and as well as a biomechanist. So I graduated as a podiatrist and then went and did a master's in human movement, my PhD in sort of footwear biomechanics and foot and ankle sort of function with people with sort of plantar heel pain and a couple of other orthopedic conditions. And then I went and did my postdoc in running physiology and footwear interventions and how footwear can influence running performance. So that's probably a very quick summary of, I guess, my sort of academic career. Back in 2010, I founded the Biomechanics Lab with a vision to be able to provide recreational and elite athletes the same technology that was available in elite sports institutes to hopefully help them reduce injury and also improve their performance as well. So that will give you the quick sort of 30, 60-second summary of where I'm at and yeah, where I've come from.
Perfect. Thanks for that. And Josh, I'll just unmute you and then put you in the spotlight.
Good to go?
Go for it. Give us your 60-second intro.
Well, yeah, fantastic. Well, first, thank you very much for having me too, Jason, and welcome along, everybody. So my experience in run specialty game, I've been working for a company called Joggers World now for 13 years. And prior to that, I had a stint at a professional football team. I was with the Sydney Swans for 3 seasons. And then after a couple of injury-riddled years, I then found my way back to my home club, Glenelg, in the SANFL, and played for further 4 seasons there. But that was while still working at Joggers World. During that time, during my whole football career, I've always had a passion for running. And through my football career and then post-football career, have obviously enjoyed running and got into some triathlons myself. But my role within Joggers World is a little bit different. Back in 2019, I founded a new gait analysis technology called Run DNA, and it was a bit of a work in progress over a couple of years, but it's a system we've had in the shop now for the best part of 12 months, and we've been introducing it slowly into the run specialty game, and it's a slightly different take on what we currently do with fitting running shoes. So essentially, for 20 years, we've been doing a video gait analysis, so filming people from the rear and the side. Now we just combine that with accelerometers, which you place on top of shoelaces to capture as much data points on a runner to measure how essentially they move inside a running shoe as best as we possibly can in this retail space. So that's a little bit of a snap on me, Jason. So yeah.
Perfect. All right. So let me check myself up. So tonight, guys, we decided to put this together, bring these two people in a room. We'll call it a room, a virtual room, to go over a few things. Obviously, the current scenario with COVID and no events, a few things that have altered your training plan. So for the triathletes, there's no pool. So the main things you can do if you want to don't game, or if you still are game enough to get in the water, in the open water, awesome. Good luck for you. I'm not. It's too cold for me. But obviously you sort of say, my training load was X before COVID and I've now got this extra time because I'm not swimming or I'm not doing this, or you want to keep building in your running, or you want to improve your strength or your conditioning. Some things start to happen, especially with running, in terms of injuries, overuse injuries. And realistically, what we wanted to do is quickly talk about managing that load. So we'll throw over to Chris to start with about managing the load when you start increasing, and what that can have an effect on the body if you do it not wrong, but if you do it poorly and too quickly. Hold up, Chris, you're just muted. Where'd you go? Chris. Unmute. Now go. Sorry.
Perfect, mate. Thanks for unmuting, mate. So I guess when we talk about load, I actually think it's misinterpreted by a lot of people. Load is not just volume. And so if we're talking about volume, people go, okay, instantaneously what's happened is I've just increased my running kilometres. And that's fine. But 20 kilometres a week at 4-minute K pace is different to 20 kilometres a week at 5-minute K pace, which is different to 20 kilometres at 6K pace. But it's also different to 20 kilometres spread over a different distribution of training. Now, a lot of people go, right, okay, I'm just going to go and run. I'm just going to go out and I'll see how I feel, and I'll listen to my body. But that's going to load different tissues at different rates and different capacities. And so where we see a lot of issues come up is more so in the, I guess, what we call training errors or training prescription errors, where we've either done sort of too much too soon, or we've done more than what the body can handle. So when I get patients like this, either in the clinic or out at events, I talk to them about capacity. Because for me, capacity is a very different thing to overall load. I talk about building blocks and having the foundation to be able to run further, run stronger. And so when we're talking about load, if we're going to increase our overall volume, I find that we've got to have the strength to be able to do that. Okay, and that's one thing. And I think there's not enough people who do strength training. And that may be neuromotor control, that may be mobility, that may be pure strength. But I think there's also other people who, at the same time, increase running load, but beyond the realms of what's possible. And so what running longer but at a slower rate may actually be more beneficial than going out running faster for a longer period of time. So those that might sit there and go and do a 10K run or a 5K run at 5-minute pace will actually probably get more benefit if they're wanting to increase their load by increasing the distance but slowing down the actual velocity of sort of movement and potentially increasing the duration. But you also want to mix that up. So obviously, training intensity distribution is a big thing, and there's plenty of people who've got different takes about where things are at. But when we talk load, it's not like this 10% rule that's been there for so long is not gospel. You can quite often run more than the 10% if you've actually got the capacity and the plan about it to actually safely increase that overall load. So, that opens up a variety of questions. But for me, the take-homes on load are, do you have the capacity in your body, and particularly your musculoskeletal system, to be able to do that? And do you actually have a plan physiologically, biomechanically, and neuromuscularly to be able to handle any increase in volume?
Perfect. Thanks for that. Josh, do you have a perspective on load in terms of when you start to increase your load in running, what that means with your shoes and that type of thing? Hold up. Josh, you should be able to unmute yourself. Now go.
Sorry, mate. All good?
Yep.
Sort of to echo what Chris is just saying there, I think a lot of the time with runners, we tend to obviously manage ourselves as best as we possibly can. So you hear a lot of the time, you listen to your own body. So what that essentially means from our perspective is okay, am I comfortable when I run? And what actually constitutes discomfort? So is it pulling up sore? Is it during my run, or is it obviously increasing or just adding a new sort of running program to your schedule? But from a footwear perspective, what we like to do is we like to obviously ensure people are mixing things up. So it's as simple as ensuring you've got, a mileage shoe, you've got a tempo shoe, which can sort of cover off as a race shoe as well. So what we tend to find is, or what we know is, when people run and they go for a longer, slower run, to their mileage run for the week, they will run a specific way. So ground contact time increases. So their requirements on a shoe are different than what they would be when they go for a session, like a tempo run, a threshold run, or do some interval running. So it's really important that from a shoe selection perspective, you are being fitted in the right shoes to cater for exactly what you're looking to do in them. So we know that if you keep using the one shoe for your mileage, your tempos, your intervals, the shoe itself compresses pretty quickly. And two, you potentially may run the risk of an overuse injury if you just keep using that same specific shoe. Also, to keep in mind, it's not as easy as just walking into a shop and going, cool, I want a lightweight shoe, show me your 5 to 6 lightweight options. Or same thing goes with buying a mileage shoe. Chris will shed some light on this, but you've got to profile the runner. So in our space, what we do is we essentially make sure we know what their requirements are within a running shoe, and then we pick the running shoe based on comfort. And comfort can be sort of measured in a number of specific ways. It's very hard to put a number on comfort, but how do you feel inside a running shoe? Is the shoe changing how you're making contact with the ground and how you're leaving the ground? So we want to make sure that you're comfortable within the running shoe, but comfort can also be measured post-run and see how you recover after a run as well. So we can talk about that for hours, Jace. But Chris has obviously got a really good insight into comfort with running shoes as well.
Perfect. So yeah, guys, with load management, if you have a coach, that is where you need to start working with your coach around load management and making sure that they're fully aware of obviously your demands that you're putting into your body. And then my philosophy is always talk to the experts, and hence why we've got Chris and Josh here, really, really knowledgeable in that space. So my suggestion to you guys is, if you want to know more about load management, is obviously very it's relative to you. So it's obviously relative to everyone's body weight, height, running style, running techniques. So really working with your coach, your club is quite crucial there. But also with load management comes the risk of injuries. So if you don't have that correct load management, injuries obviously start to play up. So Chris, did you want to go into a little bit of injury, making sure what are key focuses here to look out for with injury management around increased load?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually giving this, I guess, sort of chat is timely, because I'm actually giving a presentation next week that I'm writing exactly on this of how to maybe approach a runner to try and reduce the overall sort of burden or risk of injury. The first thing I want to say on injury, right, is what people present with is an injury may not actually be an injury. And where I think people go wrong with is, I will deload when I'm in the presence of pain. I think I've got an injury, so I'll deload. And sometimes that's the worst thing that can actually happen. So the problem is, do you actually have an a repetitive sort of running issue as presenting as a problem, but you can actually still run? Or do you differentiate from the ability where you actually need to cease your training for, the literature will say anywhere between 3 and 7 days to find an actual injury? I think most of it is quite often the body's adaptation to a stimulus that maybe the body's sort of not used to, right? As an acute overload that we will adapt, and the body is very good at adapting. I've probably got 5 strategies when I talk about injury that I talk to people about. And they probably go down sort of a funnel of what's sort of the most important, right down to sort of the one percenters. We spoke about sort of load management, and I think that's certainly one of the most important in the overall program, but also the habits that are associated with the individual and about how they train. I think most of the things that I sort of see in clinic or see out in the world or when we're designing footwear are more issues with regards to the prescription of training and how someone's gone about that, rather than an incapacity to be able to handle it, rather than someone's biomechanics, rather than or their shoe that they're wearing or whatever that may be. So first of all, it's load management, and that is very, very tricky, particularly in the world of triathlon, where you're also pumping in, X amount of Ks on the bike, and you've also got in the pool as well, and you've got family, you've got work and a range of things. So load management is a big thing, and it's a tricky thing to balance. If we start getting down to specifics, I'm big on tissue capacity. I think if we start to think, and again, I'll be trying to be specific for triathlon here for a second, of what most people are sitting there and running the legs of in triathlon are going to be what I start to call recreational running speeds. And we know that what actually happens for the muscular demand, or where the muscles are actually contributing most of the energy to power, propulsion and running speed, is largely going to come around from the gastroc-soleus complex. There's a lot of focus on high-end sort of sprinting and fast running about the hip extensors and the hamstrings, but actually taking a focus on where we're getting the greatest muscle contribution to be able to power running is really important. And we know that the load being borne or on this, particularly the sort of soleus muscle, as well as the gastroc muscle, up to a speed of about 18 Ks an hour or 3-minute Ks, is the highest of anywhere. So it's ensuring that we have the ability to do that, to generate a muscle force to be able to power propulsion sort of stride after stride, and ensuring not necessarily sort of got the strength and the durability and the volume in the legs and the Ks and the plyometric training and all of that, but also that there's not necessarily barriers to being able to utilize that function. And I'm sure we'll get into footwear later, but I think that's one of the things that I'm starting to see in both clinical practice as well as my role in footwear design, is we're starting to see this trend of carbon fiber foot plates and stiff sole shoes, where the shoe is going to do some of the work for you, and that's fine if you're Kipchoge or you're running sort of sub 3-minute K. But at the end of the day, if you are having a shoe do some of the work for you, and you can't generate actually the musculoskeletal demand to be able to propel, you may actually fatigue quicker. So I think the shoe, there's a lot more science to shoe choice and the interaction of the shoe and the body than a lot of people give due credit to. And again, I'm sure we'll discuss that in a little bit. So one, we've got tissue capacity. I've just isolated soleus there because I think it's a really important muscle, but there's a range of other muscles obviously that contribute to the vertical and the posterior anterior posterior braking forces. But if we get then down to the biomechanics side of things, I do think biomechanics is particularly important, and I think if we look at maybe some of the key metrics that I look in, is so many people I see that have overuse running injuries or at recreational speeds or having issues come from an inflexibility of the big toe. And if we don't necessarily have the bend to be able to do that, we will get compensations at the level of gastroc soleus or the knees and the hips to try and make up for that. You need flexion of the MTP to be able to power propulsion. It's really, really important. And this is a thing that, again, in footwear design hasn't really been thought through a hell of a lot, because you've got plates and toe springs of shoes that will stiffen the big toe, will stiffen the forefoot, but will replace the function of that forefoot as long as we're running at a certain velocity to be able to maximize the benefit of that design feature. But if we're running at 10 Ks an hour, 6-minute Ks, we're not necessarily going to have the velocity of movement through propulsion to get the true effect of that. And that's where we're starting to see almost this jamming up of the body and starting to see sort of, overuse ankle injuries, and, speak to a couple of sort of sports stock out there who are starting to see some pelvic girdle issues and some hip problems as well. So we really need to start thinking about sort of footwear as a prescription. I think the other thing just to touch on in biomechanics, and again, I talk to patients on a daily basis, is I don't really care how much the foot pronates. It's a big thing that everyone carries out. Oh, my foot rolls in, so I need to go on a motion control shoe, or I'm at an increased risk of injury. That's not necessarily the case. It's how our body interacts with the forces being applied to it. And for me, when I analyze patients, particularly in the lab, I'm looking at how they generate propulsive power, be able to propel them forward. And certainly that is going to be influenced by sort of things like sort of pronation and external rotation. But for me, if I've got the ability to be able to generate a propulsive power, especially in sort of, running something like tri, where we're a bit more of a straight lined activity, ultimately it becomes less and less about the fact whether we pronate. We want to pronate to attenuate shock absorption, but we want to do it in a controlled manner. So there's a lot more emphasis on dynamic sort of foot stability and control, and the ability to adapt to the external environment. So I guess they're probably my big sort of 5 things, not to ramble on, but, tissue or load management, huge, right? Training habits, just as big. Then there's going to be a tissue capacity. Do we have the strength to be able to power running? Then there's going to be the biomechanics and trying to get some metrics to be able to understand that. And then obviously the influence of footwear on that as well. Josh, do you have anything to say on sort of the footwear side of things?
Before we go to Josh, 2 seconds.
Yeah,
I've just got a few questions for you, Chris,
Yep.
while you're still talking.
Beautiful.
In terms of bare footwork, would that help strengthen the foot in terms of and tissues and everything around that?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, right? This opens up a can of worms, depends on which side of the fence you sort of sit on. I don't mind barefoot training as a new stimulus to add in. So, for example, when I've got someone in the gym or in the clinic, I get them to do a lot of their dynamic stability sort of work, even some of their early plyometric work without shoes on, because it allows us to look at sort of the elastic function of the tendons, and it looks at that dynamic control. I'm not a big advocate, obviously, of barefoot running, but for me, if there's some warm-up strategies, and particularly some work in terms of the gym from a mobility and a dynamic function point of view that we want to do barefoot, where we don't have the external constraints of the shoe, I'm all for that. But I'm not a big barefoot running person per se.
And then obviously you said big toe can play a main part. How do you strengthen and flexible, make it a bit more flexibility through it?
Pull it and twist it and do a range of different things. So
yes,
honestly, so I've spent probably the last 18 months working on a shoe or the background of Glide Ride Evo Ride for those who, and trying to understand right from a spectrum of elite runners who want to be able to power propulsive running through to the master's age athlete, where we will see that in our community, where naturally there's just some biomechanical or age-related stiffness. For me, it's really simple. If you've got to understand whether that's structurally stiff, so is it arthritic? Is there actually a block in the motion of the big toe? I generally aim clinically for about 30 degrees of big toe flexion. And when we translate that to gait analysis, we're generally getting enough range of motion to not impede the function of the gastrosoleus muscle to be able to power going forward. But again, that's just stuff we use in the lab. There's no empirical evidence necessarily to support that exact number, so don't quote me on it. But at the same time, there's so many people that it's just from a stiffness point of view, whether they've had surgery or they've had an injury and they've never actually appropriately rehabbed that. There's a range of sort of calf raise techniques where you can utilize to sort of try and self-mobilize that. But also, the age-old trick of just getting sort of a spiky ball or a hard ball and releasing sort of through the plantar fascia and some of the intrinsic muscles of the foot will do a lot to actually release the actual tensile load and the stiffness of those plantar intrinsic muscles. And ultimately, when we go up onto the big toe and we can effectively lengthen that, we might actually get some more range. So, there's a couple of small little cues or tips there, but ultimately, if it's painful or if it's stiff, you might want to sort of have a chat to a health professional about that.
And then just one more question for you, Chris, before I jump over to Josh. Mobo board, your experiences, thoughts, or any knowledge around that?
Don't know what it is, no experience on it. If someone wants to explain it, I'm more than happy to give my 2 cents. But
no, there's a Claire has said there's a good podcast on it. So we might get Claire to post that in the group so that if anyone wants to look into it, or you can look into it, Chris. But that was
How about I'll go and look into it, and I'll flip Jace my reply, and he can circulate it.
Sounds great. Perfect. Josh, your turn. How about your thoughts in terms of injury management when we look at shoe selection, rotation? Let's start talking about rotation, especially when we start talking about training at different intensities as well, and what that means for the shoe selection.
Yep. Well, thank you, Jason. So what essentially, when you're selecting any running shoe, you've got to identify what you want to get out of every running shoe. Now, nowadays, we've just highlighted with carbon plates that are in shoes, and they do make running at pace a lot easier. And good luck trying to tell someone to not buy a carbon plate shoe if it's a lot easier to run in. That's a delicate one in this space. But what you want to make sure you're doing, that when you sort of got your rotation of running shoes going, is that you almost need to know that when you put your running shoe on, you got confidence in that pair of shoes. So what I'm trying to say there is essentially, yes, comfort is vitally important, and I just want to touch on comfort for 2 ticks, if that's okay, Jace, because what we've seen over 13 years I've seen over 13 years of being in this game, this shoe development, is that 80% of our shoe sales a decade ago was in arch support or specific shoes designed like your Kayanos, your Brooks Adrenalines, of the like. So all about catering for that arch. Now, snapshot today, it's done a reverse. We're actually selling 80% of neutral running shoes in comparison to 20% of shoes with arch support inside them. So I'll be buggered. We aren't changing the way we run. We're all running pretty similar. Evolution in our running gaits haven't sort of varied in 10 years, but it's really, really evident that brands are going down the path of making shoes more comfortable from that first step in. So when you're coming into a specialty retail shop and you put your foot inside a running shoe, you want to feel comfortable straight away. Now, that opens up a can of worms, because comfort and function, it can be 2 totally different things. You've got to make sure that, one, you're in the right pair of running shoes. So one, getting back to shoe rotation. So let's look at your mileage shoes. It's got to ensure it's got ample cushioning for who you are as a runner, and everyone is completely different, whether you're talking heel striker, midfoot striker, or forefoot striker. So you got to make sure that you've got the ample cushioning in the area of your first point of contact with the ground. Take consideration any sore spots or injury history. So we don't want to overload any specific parts of your lower limb. And believe it or not, if you can get your running shoe that does, whether it's too flexible through the forefoot, and we want to sort of create a slightly stiffer forefoot in the running shoe, it does take a big part in regards to selecting a shoe to ensure you're comfortable inside that. When you're looking at your sort of lighter weight shoes, we've seen obviously racing flats over the last couple of years. Let's talk sort of 4 to 5 years now. Racing flats were very low profile. It was all about a firm, responsive feel on the ground, and it was generally you who was creating that energy return, you as a runner, because there was next to nothing underneath your foot. Now we've got your racing flats like your Next Percents, and even the new introduction of sort of your Hyperion Elite from Brooks, and also the Fuel Cell TC, that are stacked up, very, very high stacked running shoes. And high off the ground, obviously the carbon plate to create that propulsion. Now, when you're selecting a tempo shoe, one, you've got to understand that you're going to have a higher velocity of movement going through your body. You've got to make sure that, one, you can actually sustain that running form. That's what we do in the Run DNA lab, is when we're actually looking at someone and we're fitting them in a shoe for interval running or tempo running. One, it's a great way for us to do video gate, but also capture some data on them and see their movement path. Because a lot of the times a shoe, I think there's a bit of a misconception out there. The shoe's a bit of a magic wand, in which that someone comes in and the shoes are a bit tired and they think the shoe's going to do all the work for them when they get a new pair of shoes. But what we like to do in the lab is highlight your asymmetries and see what your movement paths are. And if there's something that's out of our control in regards to the specialty retail space, we will communicate that to you, and then you can communicate it to your allied health partner, be a podiatrist, physio, exercise physiologist, etc., to help you manage your body better, to ensure you can actually get yourself into some interval and tempo runs. I want to just touch on quickly in regards to, I won't say fads, but I'll use the terminology. My friend has Shoe X, and I've come in here and I'd like to buy this shoe. That's great, and obviously I think we're all educated enough here to know that there are horses for courses. So what works for your running buddy or your mate at the triathlon club doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for you. And so we try to remove all marketing, now that being brand marketing in store, and also the marketing that comes from your social running groups, to ensure that when we're fitting a running shoe, it's dialed into your specific requirements, not the person that told you to buy them, if that makes sense. Jace, orthotics, another one too. So we're going to talk about orthotics. I mean, I'm sure there's a big bunch of you on this chat tonight that have orthotics, and that changes the shoe in which we want to put you in. Pardon me. So 10% of our fits that we do at Joggers World here are orthotics and make their way into that environment. So it's really important that we look at a number of things: where the support is in the orthotic, how flexible it is, and also the depth of the heel raise that's coming in with that shoe, because that'll change the whole function of your shoe. We're looking at and heel counter support, midfoot support, and obviously the flexibility too. So partnering a shoe to the orthotic is really, really important as well. So, yeah.
So going off of that, obviously orthotics being podiatry, we'll get Chris's take in terms of how, say, a generic scenario, someone's gone in to see Chris in terms of overload issue with their feet and looking at their feet in terms of that, and then how, Chris, you would look to diagnose that and then work with someone like we do with Josh, because obviously we partnered with Josh first, but then Josh introduced us to you, and then the synergy that you two working together in terms of what you have on to offer. Explain that, because obviously there's a bit of what you guys do that works in unison, and then how that complements each other and how you guys work together to make it better for that individual. And I'll just unmute you. Where are you? Sorry, there's just a lot. There we go. Go for it.
Perfect. Thanks, mate. I'm just going to take a minute, Jace, if I can. I just want to go back to a couple of things Josh was saying, because I guess I want to blend medical and footwear choice for a second before we get on to the orthotic, because I think it's important to discuss this at the moment, because when we talk about a footwear, by technical definition, footwear is an orthotic. And what I mean by that is anything that's applied externally to the body to try and, or that could potentially influence the external forces being applied on the body, is by technical definition of an orthotic. If we go back to footwear, and look, for those that don't know, I spend a fair bit of my time sort of researching and developing with ASICs, not from a brand plug by any means. But when we go through trying to understand the interaction of footwear with the body, we're not trying to necessarily reduce injury. Like, that's the holy grail, right? Everyone wants to reduce injury, and if there was a shoe that could be proven to do that, and some companies are trying to do that at the moment, that'll be fantastic for the wider community. But of the research that's actually out there, I want to point out sort of two things. Like Josh was speaking about sort of footwear rotation and shoes. There's actually a fair bit of evidence to sit there and say that's actually, by mixing up our training, having light shoes for certain things, heavy shoes for certain others, that will actually help reduce your risk of injury. And there's a lot of sort of guys out of sort of Northern Europe who are doing a lot of work in this area. And as preliminary it is, we're talking about sample sizes of 200-300 people, where ultimately we're actually seeing a reduction in injury rates when we actually mix up our training. Now, that's not as simple as just going into Josh and saying, hey, I need two different shoes and I need a pink one and a blue one, right? That is, it's got to be a prescription. And what are we trying to achieve when we do that, or when we prescribe different shoes? Because whenever I lecture around, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, or globally, to particularly retail, I go, Chris, the two shoe choice is so hard. Because, people don't want to come in and spend $400, $500 on two different shoes. And my answer back to them is like, well, hang on a second. What is the purpose by which we might need two different shoes? And it's the exact argument that we'll go through when we start talking about orthotics. But just before we get to the orthotic side of things, when we talk about footwear, we're running a big study at the moment, because one of the things that really frustrates me is that we're in an epidemic of foams at the moment. And every shoe has the world's most magic foam out there. And put simply, me weighing in excess of 100 kilos, I'm going to interact with that foam differently to a 50-kilo female runner. And ultimately, the density and the distribution of material within that foam does not change within a size run of shoe. And so we haven't actually fully understood the interaction between different footwear designs and what people need. So, for example, one of the studies that we're running at the moment is we've got 3 different shoes that we've manufactured with different density of footwear. And what we're ultimately doing is we're getting runners to run of all different levels, size, body mass, gender, foot posture, running history, experience, injury history. And we're basically saying, what do you prefer? And let's just, for all intents and purposes, say that's soft, medium, and hard. We're seeing heavier runners and more experienced runners like thermosoled shoes, because the anecdotal feedback is they're getting greater proprioceptive aspect from the ground. But we're seeing lighter runners like more cushioned runners and more cushioned and as sort of midsoles. But when we talk about midsole foams, the one conversation no one's actually had is, it may feel like what it's great in store, but what does that feel like 10, 15, 20 Ks down the road? What does that feel 100 Ks down the road? And ultimately, what's the lifespan of this shoe? Now, this for me is the ability to introduce the 2-shoe concept, or the basis or the scientific basis for the rotation of footwear is you've got shoes that are fit for purpose. You've got a different shoe for the trail that you do have on the road. You've got a different shoe for the track that you have on road, and you might actually have a different shoe for a long run that what you have different for, say, some speed work. There are different purposes. The body functions differently depending on what you're asking it to do, depending on how you're utilizing it, depending on how you're using the muscles, whether you're on for a long run or you're going to start getting some more sort of faster twitch fibers firing from a bit more of an explosive sort of drill, or a faster speed session. So this is where the research is going, is that ultimately, if we vary up our footwear and we apply a model where the footwear is fit for purpose, and we're using said footwear for said reason, and that there's different footwear for different reasons, we start to think that's going to go a long way towards helping reduce our injury risk that we've seen in footwear. So that's some basis maybe into the background of evolution of footwear, and we're working like 2 years in advance of where things are, and there's other companies that are well ahead of where we are at the moment. But hopefully that'll give you an understanding of where things are going to head over the next 6 to 12 months. Back to Jace's original question around orthotics, right? I've got a bit of a different view to orthotics than what most do, and again, we spent a fair bit of time in the Gait Lab trying to understand this. If we go back to, or if we look closely at the literature about what the foot actually does when we run, it's a very different structure and function to when we walk. And I don't think many people consider that. So we walk in, we get a shoe, podiatrist, whatever it may be, and this is the problem. The amount of patients that I see on a daily basis, and I'm sure there's a lot of medicos out there say the same, who come in with a running injury but have never been looked at how they actually run. What we know is the arch is a spring, and that wants to store and release elastic energy. So the arch wants to collapse, the windlass wants to engage, the plantar intrinsic muscles are going to stabilize the longitudinal arch, and then we're going to essentially propel forward through both a propulsive power largely driven by gastrocsoleus. When we start thinking about orthotics, you go and put something really stiff up through an arch and stop that from doing it, ultimately, that's going to be really uncomfortable. You're going to get blisters, but it's going to impede the function that's associated with how the foot actually wants to function from a running point of view. So when we look at a footwear, or foot orthotics, for our runners, we're very specific about how we utilize that. And most of the force or correction that we want is generally around the subtalar joint. And we want to allow the arch to do what it wants to do. And I guess the beauty about 3D printing is it's allowed us to put the stiffness of different orthotics in different areas. So I might have a really stiff orthotic through the subtalar joint or the rear, but it might be more flexible through the sort of the midfoot and the forefoot to allow the arch to do what it wants to do. And ultimately, we know if we don't impede arch function, we are more economical. So what we mean by that, we're using less oxygen to be able to run. And ultimately what we've shown, particularly with an honours student over the last 2 years that I've had at Uni SA, is that if we've managed to actually introduce this orthotic function and change the stiffness of the device relative to a firmer device, we're actually negating the negative effect of on oxygen consumption that goes with a normal orthotic that's been shown in the literature by varying the stiffness. We now have another student working with myself and John Arnold, trying to understand how does that influence the biomechanical function. But at the end of the day, the reason why I research orthotics is they work in the same mechanism as footwear. It's an external device that's trying to manipulate the forces acting on the foot. It's not motion control. It's not necessarily changing the way that the foot functions. It's changing how the position and orientation by which forces are applied to the foot. And if we can get them in a more positive or a mechanically advantaged position, we will ultimately have a positive effect on running performance and hopefully injury, maybe.
And so, yeah, so you obviously look at that side of it, and then you would prescribe your recommendations, and then you would push it on over to Josh. Sort of, that's how you two work together?
I flip it the other way, to be honest. And Josh might be able to take it because he's probably seen a few of my patients. But I'm sorry, my earpiece keeps falling out. I work with people by building what I call the foundation, right? I explain to my patients it's like building a house. You need the foundations before you can build the walls and then the roof. And so if I'm going to start sitting there and looking at an orthotic, or I think there's a case of this orthotic, I go, but you've got terrible shoes. I'm going to start with a shoe. So I will quite often prescribe through and go, Josh, this is what I want to achieve as baseline. This is what I want the foundations of this runner to be. Now, that may be neutral, that may be posted, and we give obviously a little bit more information about that. But I start with the foundation and go, right, let's get the shoe that we want. And then I will add layers to that. And that layer may be a strength and conditioning program. That layer may be an orthotic. I'm not a big gait education or retraining person. And so generally it's the orthotic or the strength and conditioning sort of type work. But I would always generally go shoe purchase, optimization first before I'd introduce anything new into the system. Now, there's not a lot of people that do that. A lot of people go, oh, you got a sore foot, you pronate, oh, let's go into a pair of orthotics, or let's do that, right? At the end of the day, the orthotic should always supplement the shoe that's going into. If you've got a shoe and an orthotic working totally opposite, you're going to get a bad result. You need to understand how is the individual interacting with that shoe, and is that appropriate? If it is, tick, fantastic. Do they need anything more on top of that? That's when I come in and then I add the layers on top to obviously optimize the outcome for the patient.
Perfect. So now we'll chuck over to Josh. So Josh, Chris has obviously thrown someone your way, and then this sort of answers a question just for in the group about what you guys do, like compared to like another competitor in the field, and working with podiatrists like Chris in how you use your technology to then find that shoe.
Yeah, for sure. So if I just use an example, it sort of Chris has shed light to. So what we had previously done, and a lot of our competitors do is video gait analysis, and there's great evidence to back that up. And video gait analysis is a fantastic way to visualize how someone is performing within a running shoe. We've just gone one step further than that, and with our partnership with RunScribe, we use accelerometers that we place on top of the shoelaces, and we're capturing around 9,000 data points every single step. So what we're talking here is we're talking across efficiency metrics. So we're looking at ground contact time, both left and right. We're looking at flight ratio, percent of time off the ground. And then we dive into the shock metrics. So now we can measure impact force, braking force, and then we dive down to motion metrics. You can look at the angle at which someone makes contact with the ground, the total range of movement for that foot, and the velocity of movement within the shoe. So Chris touched on it earlier, but pronation isn't a bad thing. It's natural. I mean, whether you overpronate, underpronate, it's our body's way to absorb that impact and then turn it into energy return. But the velocity of movement's a pretty key indicator in regards to how someone feels inside a running shoe. So we have the ability to measure degrees per second within a running shoe using RunScribe. So when you're running over our treadmill upstairs here, if we see a high velocity of movement and then we have a sort of a vertical ground reaction force graph, we can actually see where that movement is placed. So if it's in your contact point with the ground or if it's in toe off. And what we use that data then to do is then assign the right shoe to use. So you can actually get objective data from RunScribe and layer it with the subjective feel of one's runner. So more often than not, when someone gets off the treadmill, we actually get them to line the shoes up in from least to most comfortable to least comfortable. And then on the reverse, we do the same thing with what we see in the data. And 90% of the time, the shoe that they feel most comfortable in registered the most efficient metrics from RunScribe. So that's how we differ from our competition. We also use VideoGate at the same time because it's good for the consumer to actually visualize and see yourself moving within that shoe, but having the ability to measure how you're moving within a running shoe is great. And then from that, we can then share that information on to the referring podiatrist as well. Chris has the ability to go one step further into three-dimensional labs, so using high-speed cameras. So we don't sit there and we don't compete with what Chris's technology is, because at the end of the day, Joggers World is a specialty running shoe shop. And we have the technology now to see how you move within specific shoes to make an educated choice on that specific shoe. There has been a couple of times in our Run DNA lab where someone's jumped up and they've registered some pain points and whatnot, and they've gone through the process, and literally 4 or 5 pairs of shoes have all registered some high imbalances across that runner's gait. And it would be really irresponsible of us to sell that person a running shoe. There is clearly something else going on with that runner that they need to address. So if they do have a podiatrist or a physiotherapist that they need to go see, the trust and go see, then we would then share that information on to that referring partner and write a bit of a report on what we've picked up in the lab. Alternatively, if they don't have one, we'll work with our close core group of podiatrists and physiotherapists that we believe can produce the best result for that client in store. So it's a very, very delicate one. You've got to have a really good relationship with referrers, and we do. We have a great relationship with all of our referring partners. But it's not as simple as here's an orthotic, go get yourself a neutral shoe and we'll see you in a few weeks' time. No, there is a lot more to it nowadays. And having the ability for what we do in the Run DNA lab, seeing entry point, exit point, and the movement within a running shoe using these accelerometers is fantastic. We could also take that out to the road. So yes, we do it on the treadmill. Yes, 99.9% of people probably don't use treadmills. It's fine, but we have to use a treadmill to protect our assets, which is our stock in the store. But it's great for us to grab RunScribe and get some data on someone on a training week, for example. So go out on the road, take the pods, and we'll come back and we'll have a look and see how they're moving in their natural environment as well. So that's another little point of difference that we have over our competitors.
Perfect. And just a quick question, Josh, just on RunScribe in terms of the metrics. Yep. Obviously, I've gone through the whole system and know exactly, but in terms of what it actually gives, like in terms of your power, your angle of pronation, the X, Y, Z, like your rebound, go for it.
Yeah, sure. So it's split into 3 categories. So there's the group of efficiency metrics, there's a group of shock metrics, and there's the group of motion metrics. So those 3 core groups is what we use. So when we're talking efficiency metrics, we're measuring your ground contact time, both left and right, measured in milliseconds from the entry point to the exit point. Flight ratio, so percent of time off the ground, or a flight mode, one of a better term. Power is another one that's been put into that. We don't use power to fit running shoes, because there's kind of a fair bit of variables that come into play in that space for runners especially. It's a good tool, and I know a lot of you out there would probably use a product called Stride or other measuring tools for power, but we don't use it in a shoe fitting scenario. Shock metrics, so we're looking at impact shock that goes through the body, so impact force and that vertical pressure. Braking force was essentially what happens to your foot on deceleration, and seeing what variance we have there. And then we jump down into motion metrics. Now, motion metrics is how we've been fitting running shoes for a long period of time. So video gait analysis, we see the amount of pronation we can now, there's a lot of apps out there that we can measure the amount of movement, but that's taken over maybe 1 or 2 steps on a treadmill when you go into a running shop. So they'll film you, and then from you running for 1 minute, they'll then show you highlight maybe 2, 3, 4 steps. RunScribe, we collect every single step in movement over that 60 seconds of running. So obviously if you're running at a specific cadence, we capture a lot more data. Velocity of movement, as I highlighted before with RunScribe. So the motion metrics of velocity of movement, the degrees per second, is a great measuring tool for us to see how someone would be comfortable inside a running shoe.
And then also just there, Josh, while I've got you on
Mhm.
screen, someone's asked about wearing a shoe or trying a shoe early in the day, in the morning, and then putting it on later at night. Obviously, if you're on your feet all day, swollen feet, like how do you go about that side of it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we all know that throughout the duration of the day, our foot will swell, will get a little bit larger. So, in consideration to that, what we do in the setting that we have upstairs is um, we get someone to run in a current running shoe first. So the reason we do that, and they select the speed as well, Jason. So whether it's morning or afternoon, so we try to, with morning and afternoon fitting of running shoes, is there a perfect time, an optimal time to come and buy your running shoes? I mean, that's, I don't believe there's been any, I haven't read any studies to suggest there is, but we do know that if you buy a running shoe in the morning, is your foot going to swell by the end of the day when you put it on? Probably is. So you're not going to swell, you're not going to get obviously growth out of your foot, you're not going to grow overnight, but we always fit running shoes with a little bit of space across the width. One, because we know that once you exercise, whether it's half an hour, hour and a half of running, your foot's going to expand inside the shoe. So naturally, when we fit a running shoe, we allow for a bit of space as well. So whether it's you buy your shoes in the morning, you go home at night time, it should still be as comfortable as what it was that morning.
And then another question, and we'll get your take on it first. Is heel striking a technique issue? Basically they're trying to find out, is heel striking wrong? And then we'll go to Chris as well.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna come at this from a running specialty store perspective. All right. So when we look at the wall behind me, and it goes quite a long way down there, all of those running shoes are built with cushioning in the heel. So brands out there, when they're manufacturing running, the majority of running shoes, they're catering for heel strikers. Now, Chris will be able to shed some light on this, but I could be wrong with my percentages. But it's still around about 70% of runners will heel strike, and that's from elite recreational runners and right down to your starters. So, is it a technical failure? I would say probably not, no, but then it's relative, isn't it? So if someone comes in and got some issues and it's aligned with their strike pattern, well, yeah, they need to potentially look at maybe getting some gait retraining, or can we get them into a shoe that's going to potentially offload the amount of impact going through that heel on that first point of contact with the ground. So I'm not going to sit there and say it's there's an issue with heel striking versus midfoot versus forefoot, because forefoot in itself has a lot of issues as well. So high velocity of movement, bigger range of movement if you're a forefoot striker as well. So going from heel to forefoot is such a big change for any runner. And we've all probably read the book Born to Run. But look, I'm of the opinion that there's no specific perfect running technique out there. I think we're all comfortable with how we run, and if there is intervention that needs to come into play, so whether someone needs to have some gait retraining, then so be it.
Perfect. And we'll chuck it over to you, Chris. Your thoughts on heel striking?
I love this conversation. So first of all, most recent stats, or the consistent stats, is actually a little bit higher than what Josh said. It's about 92.1% of all recreational elite runners are actually heel strikers. And if you look at even, the quite often quoted sort of US 10K track time trials, of those that were forefoot runners to start off with, by 50% of the way sort of through, they're actually sitting there and transitioned to actually heel strike runners. I've been to a lot of conferences around the world in both footwear biomechanics as well as running biomechanics. I'm yet to see any evidence to sit there and say heel striking's wrong. So what's the issue, right? What's the argument? You're going, okay, well, it's going to increase your risk or your patellofemoral loads, right? Okay, fantastic. At recreational runners, you transition to midfoot, forefoot, you increase your Achilles tendon load. I can guarantee not many recreational runners have the capacity to be able to handle an increase in Achilles tendon load. I can also guarantee that they don't have the ability to counteract the fatigue component that's then going to increase those Achilles tendon loads 5-10 Ks down the run. So for me, this is why I haven't been a huge believer in gait retraining, because of the sustainability. I look at trying to build sustainable athletes and sustainable runners, and I look at trying to build capacity in any tissue to be able to handle the loads. I honestly believe the way that people run is a central nervous system adaptation and ultimately we're born to run the way that we run, right? I've seen plenty of terrible running techniques get onto podiums at Olympic Games. I've seen plenty of terrible running techniques cause injury as well. A technique is not necessarily related to an injury, and it's more going to be how do we handle the load over a long period of time. Our body is set. The anatomical geometry is what it is, and a load is going to be applied to that when we run. How do we manage that load? Not loan. Okay, I'm not a bank. How do we manage that load? How do we program our training to ensure that that load is not going to cause us a problem? And how do we increase that load if we need to, right along whatever metrics that we want to understand, to ensure that any increased load is not going to necessarily cause that an injury as well. I found that to be a lot more successful strategy for me than gait retraining. The other thing that I'll say is people are saying, oh yeah, it's a midfoot striker. Oh, I'm a midfoot striker. And I don't have a shoe, and that's unusual for me because I'm sitting at home in my office. But I've yet to meet many runners that perfectly are midfoot and just land like that. They're always slightly going to be heel or slightly forefoot. If you can land perfectly on your midfoot every time, you're a very unique and rare runner. So what is this midfoot? Is it the fact that actually heel striker, but they're not, it's all about the actual sort of angulation of the actual sole of the shoe and that's on a distribution? I think that might have some arguments. Okay, and particularly some of the work that Martin Shorten's done of the steepness of the inclination of the foot at initial contact is going to give you an indication about how overstriding or how long your stride is. And don't get me started on overstriding. But for me, it's more about the braking force, okay? So if we increase our stride and those that have previously been overstriding heavy heel strikers, we'll get a very large braking force. That there is the issue. It's the large braking force, and that can be attenuated in multiple other strategies rather than changing that. And that can also be changed by increasing sort of the posterior control of the kinetic chain. So increasing the strength and the control of the gluteal muscles and the hamstrings to limit the amount of hip flexion. So there's so much more that can be done to improve and increase the sustainability of a runner, to make them strong, make them more durable, than changing their technique. Because I think as soon as you change that technique and you then have something to think about when you run the whole time, you get 6-8 weeks down the line and you've just gone back to your normal patterns. That's been my experience anyway. So I've got no problems with heel striking. Just ensure that you've got the capacity to be able to handle the load, and you're generally going to be fine.
And your thoughts, Chris, on an easy solution to help monitor and manage the load from like a software or like your thought process or feelings? Like, yeah, what's your stand on that?
Yeah, look, you can go as hard or as simple as you want to about that. I've always looked really simply, right, and without sort of boring people on some complex algorithms, and there's other people better attributed to me on this area. I like the concept of session RPE, where ultimately you're going to have a duration of session, okay, which might be 40, 60 minutes, and you're going to give yourself a rating of perceived exertion of how this load is. I'm not saying it's the best, but you basically times that to give you an arbitrary unit. So 60 minutes out of 7 out of 10 is going to give you an arbitrary unit of 420 units. And you can track that along. I think without some complex sort of tracking software, I think that's a great place to start. There's obviously things like sort of Training Peaks, Strava's got some integrations as well, but I honestly think if you are having to monitor your load so closely, you should be having a chat to someone about designing the program. I honestly believe if you are going to run more than 20 Ks a week, you should be having a proper program prescribed to you. I don't do much of that. I don't do much program prescription. So that's not a plug to go come and see me or one of my colleagues, right? I don't do much program prescription. I'm more in 3D biomechanics and footwear optimization. But if you are running that sort of volume, particularly if you're on the bike and you're in the swim, you need expert advice to go, how can I program my training so I'm getting the biggest bang for my buck? Not necessarily financially, but in terms of time. They can then sit there and talk about how we're going to monitor that training stress over a period of time, how we're going to monitor that and how that integrates with diet and sleep, and how that's going to integrate with your swimming loads and your cycling loads, your job and arrangements. Like, there's so many things that are going to come into this. So look, session RPE, really, really simple one. That I think is a nice sort of take home, and something that will fluctuate up and down. But if you want anything sort of more complex and potentially more custom, bespoke, individualized, let's go have a chat to someone who works in that area.
And then probably we'll call it last question out there for both of you. Cadence. Is a higher cadence more effective and more efficient to make you run faster? Go for it, Chris. We'll let you go first.
Oh, thanks, mate. I'm unconvinced. I don't think there's a magical cadence. I don't think the magical 180 exists. You're sitting at 140, we've got some issues. But generally, most of my runners, when I measure cadence, going to sit between 162 and 178. That's probably the best part of, and we collect this on all our runners. For me, I can't comment because I don't actively do a lot of gate training. So I'm not sitting there in a run with a runner to sit there and go, let's get our metronome out and let's start sitting at 168, 170, 172. Let's increase that by 10%. Let's get to 180. I'm not doing that. I will identify whether I think there's an issue associated with that. But what I'm more going to be doing is going at your chosen cadence, as long as that's within a realm of accepted normality. I'm going to generally try and make you a little bit more sustainable and stronger and more durable and trying to counteract fatigue rather than changing it. Because the thing I would say to this, Jason, what I say to so many of my patients is what is the metric or the baseline that we are going to aim for? What is normal? And what is normal for me is going to be normal to what's normal for you, what's normal for Josh and everything. So why is 180 so absolutely magical, right? Is it because there's a physiological cost benefit associated with that? Great. Well, at the end of the day, my VO2 is going to be totally different to yours. So you can't compare apples with apples. So for me, it's like sitting there and saying, oh, well, this is, how much the foot should pronate, or this is the perfect shoe for you, or whatever it may be. Trying to get these, holy grails towards a number that we're going to sort of sit at. It just doesn't work, and we need to be a lot more individualized than that. And I think where people go wrong with sort of, following online coaching programs out is going, we're going to now set this week and we're going to do this K at this volume, or we're going to hit this cadence, or we're going to do this, or everyone should be running at 180. Everyone is built differently. And ultimately, one or two, a quick chat with a professional can factor in those individual inferences associated with how sort of someone runs and trains, and you can get a pretty bespoke solution sort of for you. So yeah, I'm not going to sit there and measure. My outcomes are not cadence. My outcomes are a lot more probably scientific than that, but also subjective as well as that. I'm probably just going to get you into the gym and get you to run more or less.
Perfect. So I'm going to say thank you very much for both of you guys to jump on the phone call today. It has been great to have you both on deck. Obviously, there's a lot of knowledge that you guys have portrayed over tonight, and this has been recorded for anyone that did miss it. But just for anyone that does wants to reach out to Josh or Chris, their details you can either get from myself personally, so you can get my details on the Triathlon South Australia page, or just contact them individually via their stores. So Josh at Joggers World, Chris at the Biomechanics Lab. There's a few questions about who would you get to prescribe the programs and stuff like that. That's going to come down to the individual and your goal realistically. There's coaches out there for everyone, and that's my philosophy. There's a coach out there for everyone. There's not one coach that is there for everyone. Everyone needs something different out of their coach. It's about finding a coach that works for you around your time, your training management, your family, your commitments, your work. It's about finding that relationship. And then my philosophy is then, as a coach, surrounding myself with industry and professional people to help benefit my athletes like Chris and like Josh. So you will find most coaches will have resources like Chris and Josh to be able to access. So it's about finding out, one, what do you want to achieve and what is your goal? And then working with that set coach around that and their networks.
Yep.
So
Can I just say something on this, Jason? And you're absolutely right. Anytime you get advice, it's just an education. And this is what I talk to all my patients about, is they should be coming to me to help educate them about how they can do things better.
Mm-hmm.
Don't work on a basis. And if I can give anyone one tip about improving performance, wanting to go for that, don't come and go, guys, what's my magic bullet? It's ultimately, you guys know your body better than anybody else. And you're just going to source a list of experts to be able to give you information into your bubble that ultimately you have to bring together yourself and perform on race day, on the bike or the swim or the race or whatever it is. There is no panacea in all of this. And all we do is guide our athletes. I like to think I'm just an educator. I sit there and I provide informed, objective outcomes for people to be able to do that. What they do with that is them. So please look at this as going, this is a team game. You're here to educate yourself about what you want to do and how you want to go about it. As soon as you start getting told you should do this, I would start going in the other direction pretty quickly.
Perfect. And again, guys, if you do want a bit of guidance, especially in the triathlon world, in terms of location where you're at, whether you're in SA or you're interstate, because I know that there is a few interstaters on there and you need some advice in terms of who to look for, possible contacts in the interstate, contact myself and I can point you in the right directions, especially here in SA. But like I said, guys, reach out to the coaches. Obviously, if you're just here for a running point of view, contact specific runners, running coaches. If you're here for a triathlon, find that triathlon coach that has the best network that will work best for you. That is my suggestion, guys. But again, massive shout out to Chris and Josh. Thank you very much for being here and giving up your night. I appreciate it. It is a busy time. But like I said, guys, reach out to Josh, reach out to Chris if you have any questions, or come to me. But other than that, look out for our next workshop. And if you are on Zwift, we have our first Zwift ride this Saturday. Just a little plug there.
Yes. I love it.
No worries. Well, thanks for having us, Jason. Thanks for organising. It's been a pleasure.
No stress, guys.
Thanks.
Go for it.
Thanks for having us, Jason. I just want to say to everyone out there, stay safe, be kind to each other, and enjoy your training during this time.
Thanks, guys.
Run safe. Ciao.